minute to gregariousness and affability, but which of those tendencies, the tendency to be a rule formulator and principle propounder, or a tendency to be a rule avoider, principle avoider, and an incrementalist, is in the long run the more dangerous. It may be seen as modest to go a step at a time, but when the court does that, as in Plyler v. Doe, when the Supreme Court said that for a state to deny free public education to the children of aliens is unconstitutional because, and all sorts of factors entered the picture, because these children did nothing wrong. It wasn't their fault that their parents came here illegally. Because denying them a free public education will condemn them to occupying a permanent underclass. Because education is not just any old good, but somewhat resembles a fundamental right like speech. A whole bunch of factors. Well, the critics, the dissenters, said, there's no principle here. You're not acting like a court. You're simply putting together a policy made out of a kind of pastiche of factors. That's not what we expect courts to do. We expect courts to be principled. But when, at the other extreme, courts are extremely principled, when they explain in some detail that we're going to require certain warnings to be given to suspects about their right to silence, because of the proposition that until and unless someone comes up with something better, in the absence of those warnings, there is too great a danger of undetectable and undemonstrable coercion. And so the court comes out with the Miranda rules, and then they're attacked as having too legislative a set of principles. That's not what a court is supposed to do. It's supposed to decide a case on all its facts. So it's damned if you do and damned if you don't. And I think the real lesson should be that variables other than how incremental is the step ought to be at play and ought to be underscored. Now, I think that it's a mistake, to some extent, a mistake made by Sunstein and Rosen to equate incrementalism and the resistance to principles with the willingness to pay attention to the consequences of whatever rule one formulates, whatever step one takes. That's the mistake I think the Thornstroms made in accusing O'Connor of being unprincipled, when the principle, in fact, was simply more nuanced. The principle was one can take race into account as long as one does it in an individualized way without establishing a quota, and here are the reasons, and here are the consequences that would follow from a different rule. It seems to me that one can talk about the virtues of judging which is disembodied and separated from real consequences. I suppose it has some virtues. It has the virtue of making the judge more immune to the temptations of the real world and the virtues of taking the world into account. Clearly, I come down on the side of taking it into account. What makes Roberts appealing to me in part is that he takes it into account in a richer way than Scalia and Thomas do. Now, I think separate from that is the question of which style is likely to be more influential. And that, I think, is determined not by whether you are a gradualist and an incrementalist or a rule and model builder. Brennan was a rule maker, model builder par excellence. He was an architect. He devised rules upon rules. And yet he was the glad-hander to end all glad-handing. He was wonderfully gregarious, loved by all his colleagues. Rehnquist was also loved by all his colleagues, less obviously affable to the outside world, but terrific inside, very fair in his treatment of his colleagues, and he was a prudential sort, paid a lot of attention to the real world, was quite impatient with abstraction. The fact is that I think one can't predict influence from that. One can predict influence from the capacities of empathy, lack of inordinate pride, a degree of humility and modesty. Roberts has all of those in a way that Scalia doesn't. Roberts has them in a way that Thomas, to some extent, does, but Thomas doesn't tend to reach out, at least so far, to the degree that I think Roberts will. So it clearly will make him more influential, much more influential. Separate from that is the third dimension. Is that dangerous or not? Well, it depends on whether you like the direction in which you think he might influence. If you think that he will just axiomatically be pulling the court in what you think of as a bad direction, that he is really Scalia in drag with a smile, but with Scalia's compass, then I guess you lament the fact that he is at least as smart as Scalia. Scalia may not admit it, but perhaps smarter. At least it's possible. And certainly less prone to acerbic and acid remarks, more likely to win friends and influence people on the court. If you think that it's indeterminate whether the direction in which he will pull the court is one that sort of the party of humanity ought in the abstract to applaud, partly because one doesn't know in what direction things will move, because unlike the great shift of 1937, when everything seemed to be pulling in the same direction, the variables of autonomy versus government and of federal versus state and of property versus community may point more often in different directions, as they did in the marijuana case. And if for those reasons you have a harder time guessing whether you think that the lodestar that Roberts will gradually follow, a harder time assessing whether you like it or not, the fact that he's likely to be more influential might seem like a neutral factor. Might be good, might be bad, depending on whether you like where he's going.
There's a question over here. Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering, given that no senator really pushed Roberts too hard on the unavailability of a Solicitor General documents, and that was the thrust of the defense against Miguel Estrada, does he become more likely as a second nominee?
He's not even conceivable as the second nominee.
You don't think so?
First of all, he's taken himself out of consideration, but secondly, if there's ever been someone who, as a result of both personal pain and things that have happened in his family and the sense that it wasn't an entirely graceful performance by anybody who's out of the question, I think he is. He does meet one desideratum. That is, there's a lot of pressure on the president not to name simply another white male. I mean, to name an Hispanic would be a plus. And there are a lot of questions about how plausible Alberto Gonzalez is. Whether the Phyllis Schlafly's and others on the right who say anybody but Alberto are just saying what Brer Rabbit said, any place but the briar patch. Don't throw me into that briar patch. Whereas, in fact, for those people who've ever in their childhood read Uncle Remus, they'll know that's exactly where the bunny wanted to go. Well, it may be that this is a feint on the part of the right. What to make of Specter's announcement at the beginning of the hearings, as far as he's concerned, don't send us Alberto Gonzalez. He's not ready for prime time. He hasn't had the experience. Subtext, he isn't sufficiently distanced from the torture memos to be plausible. I'm just not sure. I know that some Democrats think they would be happy with him. I'm not sure why exactly. Maybe because they have less confidence that he's being embraced by the right. The mantra of the Republican Party of late in the last several years has been no more suitors. Whatever else you do, don't send us somebody else who looks like he's a genuine conservative and then turns out to be a liberal in sheep's clothing. So they must know something about Roberts, is the theory. And because they haven't embraced Gonzalez warmly, we won't put that down to a conspiracy. We will conclude that they're not sure Gonzalez would do what they want on abortion and affirmative action, so we're willing to take the risk. I think all of those ways of assessing a prospective candidate, especially one who's going to be on the court for many, many years, are very short-sighted. I mean, asking just how bright somebody is, how capable is someone of, and I mean bright in terms of emotional IQ points as well as analytical IQ points, how capable is someone of getting into someone else's skin and understanding a situation, of getting it, if one wants to use that image. Those seem to me to be very much more important than exactly how trustworthy are they on a particular issue, however important that issue is at the moment.